This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board.
And I want to say thank you for being interim manager for the last year and a half. And Laurie Serve is taking over. And I wish WEFT all the best for future years. I've been there 31 years, I think, and it's. We hope we'll be here a lot longer. So, thank you. I think I want to do a cardboard rant. This week, the salvage agencies were on a slightly different timetable. So I saw this pile of paper in the garbage can, and I meant to remove it, and then when I looked around, it was all gone to the landfill. A whole lot of A-grade paper. But then I went to the cardboard bin, and I want to say that the world spends a lot of money trying to make boxes that can be pulled apart easily. If I see in the cardboard container, cardboard that has been ripped apart, very difficult to rip good cardboard apart, and when it goes into the bin, it never sits flat. So when I see that happening, I think, wow, these people who are salvaging and recycling in this manner just don't understand the volume of research that's gone on into each box. You look at the box and you find out that it often has a area at the bottom which can be easily broken, and it comes apart. It's made to do that. Then you flatten the box. You don't put a box with 25 other boxes inside it. You don't put in whole boxes. I go to the recycling agencies now have gondolas for you to put in materials. And when I went to Max the other day, there was no gondola. Why was there no gondola? They had to unload it. One of the reasons why they had to unload it was I looked into it before it went, and it had like gobs of unbroken boxes. So when they were taking that gondola away, they were taking away a lot of air. And I really wish that people would think about how to break down their boxes and flatten them. Don't throw them into the bin. If they're bigger than the size of the bin, then fold them so that they will fit flat. Beer boxes are very easy to modify. They just flatten very nicely, but if you try to pull them apart and do it otherwise, you just make a mess. So I would encourage everyone that's recycling to think about how their boxes are constructed. If they have a bottom to them, look to the bottom, and you can take your thumb and run down the plastic that is put on the bottom of most beer cartons and other cartons is not so strong that you can't break it. It's designed that way. Somebody had to spend a PhD thesis making that material so that you could break it. So if you don't have a thumb that's going to do it, grab your key, or if you, better yet, if you carry them, a box knife, and just slit it open. Then flatten the box. There's very, very little to it. You don't have to throw the box whole into the tank so that other people can't use the equipment. Some of that material goes all the way to the landfill, 30 and 40 miles, and it's up to you folk to do that. Those of us who act as involuntary policemen of garbage would welcome your few cents of time to flatten the box. End of rant. And sad comment about the loss of a bunch of A-grade paper coming out of a building that has a lot of lawyers in it, and that A-grade paper can be recycled. And incidentally, shredded paper can be recycled. It's all A-grade paper too, but it is very difficult to recycle it if you just throw it into the bin. You have to put it into a bag so it can be recycled properly. Another thing that's very awkward is, especially with plastic, please wash your milk jugs out, and please don't leave food in them, because we don't have a food recycling program, so that garbage does have to go to the landfill. But you have to think about the employees who have to grab this oily or dirty material and work with it. So a little bit of nicety, just get it under the tap and wash it out. Sometimes I'll do that. I'll take stuff out of the garbage can, wash it locally, and put it back into the plastic recycling. So think about that. More and more we have to reuse things. Okay, I've been photographing this morning. There was somebody outside with a '64 Chevy. I think it was a 64 Chevy, but it was a long. I took a photograph of that. This is very nicely reconstituted and an exhibit piece. I went around the corner to the Pocket Prairie, and there's a rather wonderful culvert route which seems to like its position there, and has about 5 or 6 candelabra type fruiting bodies, and they haven't quite opened yet, but they look very elegant. So I took photographs of them, and I will take photographs of them as they come out in flower. It's Culver's root, probably because Dr. Culver found a chemical in there that would be useful to someone. I need to say something later about biodiversity. You have to know that most of the things we eat and most of the things we use for medicine come from plants. And some of them come from modification by animals, but basically these are chemicals that are washed out of plant material. They may be washed out by using a solvent like alcohol. It may be that they're fermented right back from who knows when. People have been fermenting fruit and anything they can get hold of that has sugar in it that ferments nicely and creates alcohol and gives sensitivity. It might be that you go to Jamaica and find fungi and digest them, but you have to be fairly educated to know what you're doing. If you have belonged to a tribal unit that has lost a lot of its people to a particular plant, then you get wary about that plant. But if you're in the modern era, the first start off was that you could distill this material that is in there. And by distilling, you have to have a pot to boil. So that had to wait till there was we were past the Stone Age. We had to have a metal pot which could be boiled. So that's more or less 600 or more recently. And when you boil that material, whether it's been fermented first or not fermented, it comes up and vaporizes and goes over in a still to drop out as according to its molecular structure, and so you have a refraction column. You can tell where certain materials are going to according to their weight and characteristic. You can then take that material and put it in a spectrophotometer or something that defines the material and find out that it has a certain characteristic which might be medicinal, might be good for agriculture, like an application somewhere. But it might also be toxic, so you need to test it in a manner that you know the structure of the benzene ring or whatever it is. You can also modify it by putting a hydrogen atom on or putting a chlorine atom on and just modifying it some. But you can't create it. And so the era of when we could first of all ferment, and then we could distill. You can separate those materials out and concentrate them. The brewery people do this all the time and put it into their alcoholic beverages. So you're getting an increasing number of drinks that are modified by additions of chemicals, which actually do create wonderful flavors and make the industry of beverages more interesting, whether they be alcoholic or non-alcoholic. Additions can count, and it might be very, very small amount. But that requires quite a lot of research. But if you want medicines in the future 500 years, you need to have the vegetable material around so that you can work with it. And tribal people often knew what plants would do psychedelic things or be good for diarrhea or constipation, like pepsin. But culver's root that I was photographing probably has a medicinal background. I think it has to do with the alimentary canal, and probably takes the name of the doctor that found out about it. And so that's not unusual. So we like to see that plant around. It may not have just one chemical in it. It may have many chemicals in it. But then it is also aesthetic. Go have a look at culver's roots at this time of the year. See what bugs are on it. Enjoy them. The monarda, aromatic mint, is out in flower at the moment, but there are no bumblebees on it. It's called bee balm because it's a balm for bees, but there's no bees on it at the moment. And it's explained to me that many flowers have a prime time when they come into action, so you might not be getting pollen and nectar early in the morning when I was photographing. It may be that later in the afternoon, if you look, you will have bumblebees there. But we're faced with the fact that we don't have as many bumblebees as we used to have, and they're going out fast, so we have to think about this sort of thing and how we preserve. That's my second rant for the day. Now, a few photographs, and we drop them into our radio program, make it a video program, and eventually get it up to YouTube. Parade. We spent quite a bit of this week putting together a float. Some of it we used before. It involves expensive visual material because we don't get people to go 25 miles to find a good prairie. So that's why we have a little pocket prairie across the road. It not only helps us to interpret it to people, but it allows us to recognize when a certain plant might be in flower. So if the culver's root around the corner is growing right now, And flowering, you have to know that the temperature of a city is probably about 3 degrees higher than it is out in the boondocks. So it might be that at Rantoul, the Culvers root will be coming in a few days' time. So it gives you an alert situation. If the ironweed, which is in a moist situation, is starting to flower, I'll bet that I can go south to Arcola and find it working in a lemon prairie that is there. So we put a few plants on the float. The float was mainly Kim Campbell has a big pickup truck, and many of you know him because he's sells honey at the farmer's market. Well, Kim has a large trailer, so we've, for the last few years, been using his more modern vehicle. We used to use my old pickup truck, which to some people was an insult to the parade, but for other people, they wanted to buy it. So, because it was getting to be the antique style. But Kim has provided the vehicle, and we have sides where we make a box on top of the trailer and put up information on the vehicle itself, and some of that gave a map of what Heartland Pathways does. And we've been talking about wilderness and what wilderness is nationally, wilderness internationally, and wilderness locally. What is our wilderness? We don't quite know. So we go into the parade with probably about $1,500 worth of visual material. We hope the parade goes slow enough that people can think about it, and that it is dispersed enough that you can read it. We walk with it. It's not so happy if you have to run with it. So I have a feeling for parade organizers, but you have to hit a balance between festivity and people enjoying themselves in a festival, carnival manner, and some serious interaction. There are a lot of people out there. It's probably about a 2-mile trip from start to finish, and politicians especially need to wave to people who recognize them and perhaps even say something to them. But in order to do that, you have to go slow. So there's a sensitivity to going at 1 mile an hour versus going at 5 miles an hour. If you go 5 miles an hour, the parade is over and done. And it tends to bunch up because you get groups like the Corvettes that know about interspersing their cars. When they went from downtown last week, from downtown Champaign to Monticello and back again, they were spread out. They weren't all on top of each other. So we need to recognize that sometimes slow will be helpful. I ran into quite a few people. I went as the Prairie Monk, which is not unusual. I have my cape on, my hat on. But this time I decided that I would go with Prairie WEFT. You see, that's the program we're working with right now. And it has a large WEFT on the front of it. And so I talked to people, and I carried a microphone. And the microphone was a WEFT microphone, and it looks like a 1920s microphone. You only had to have ABC or something, Channel 2, written across it. And it would remind people it's a microphone, and I'm talking back and forth to them, and some people understood what I was doing. But I was indicating WEFT on my hat. And so help me, I picked up the wrong hat. And so it didn't have WEFT on it. And I didn't find out till I got to the end of the parade. So I was very embarrassed by doing that. But, you know, if you never do anything, you never have any problems. But the microphone, back to the microphone, this is a heavy microphone. It probably weighs about 3 pounds. or 2 pounds. And so a policeman came up to me who asked me what I had in my hand. And I had to realize that probably the policeman himself is of an era when you had a cell phone and the microphone is this little thing on the side here. And people don't recognize that this is a microphone. I reduced the size of it by doing a smaller piece of equipment. But even that, for young folk, the cell phone is the microphone. And we do have microphones right in front of me that I'm speaking into, but not many people know about that. And so that was a bummer. I felt embarrassed because I've been referring to this WEFT hat all the way along, and I think it's a good idea. I've been collecting hats, and it's amazing to me how many people know whether it's a Cubs hat or a Farm Bureau hat or what have you. So there's a whole philosophy of hats, and many people collect a lot of different hats, and they're not awfully good if you're trying to keep the sun off your rest of your body. So you really need a bigger hat if you're going to fight skin cancer. But it's a hat that gives shading to the eyes, and it's helpful. So that's probably enough about the parade itself. These things don't happen without there's a lot of other people that have been involved in one stage or another. To put this together, we had a lot of people involved. Our actual trip through the parade was not so many people, but a lot of people recognize what we do. And on the back, we put a statement to say that we get some recognition for starting the Kickapoo Trail to the east. And that was, the information was big enough that you could read it from a distance. The trailer itself was rather interesting, we felt, and informative. And we have the evil intent of taking it to the farmer's market. Now, the farmer's market is fairly organized, and you have to have permission to be in there, and there has to be a space for you. So there's a difference between spontaneity and organization. We discussed this, and we thought, well, perhaps I talked to one of the city council people, Dennis, and we thought perhaps we could take the exhibit to the farmer's market at 6 o'clock in the morning and just happen to be there and just check to see if the administration of the farmer's market could handle that. But we thought that was probably expecting too much. So we took the exhibit back to the warehouse in Bonneville and disconvolvulated it fairly quickly, and it's not totally disconvolvulated yet. The superstructure has to be taken down. But quite an event, and even if we only get 1% recognition, it's still the sort of thing that you have to do to get the public to recognize what you do and how. And we've been talking about wilderness at an international level, wilderness at a national level, wilderness at a state level, wilderness at a regional level, wilderness at a local level. And what is our wilderness? And do people care? Yes, they do care. But you have to know that the prairie that is our ecosystem has 110 species on a flat area like this. If you were in the Arkansas with some terrain, you might have 400 species. And it's not an easy ecosystem to study. And it's also an ecosystem that everyone has been trying to get rid of in order to do agriculture.
Why would you have more species when the terrain becomes less
flat.
Flat, yeah, right. It seems like it would be just more inconvenient for things to want to be there.
As you go up the mountain, you have a different temperature.
So the gradient will
rocks,
change.
And so you moving through the same ecosystem, but various expressions of it. And if you were to work it, you would find the mountainous one much more interesting in a way, and much more preservation. And we're in flat territory, and we have water and dampness that leads to a 10-foot prairie, rather than if you were out in a rain shadow area like is created by the Rocky Mountains, you would have a 2 or 3 inch prairie. So it varies, and it varies according to the geology. If you were in a plain and you were looking at the Ozarks, you could tell where the rivers are, where you can also almost define the nature of the terrain by the vegetation that you see from the air. And if you are an academic, you probably would assign different color reflections off the leaves of the plants and give them a sort of town and country planning image, but you can then assess the plants, the number of them. So if you have a plant that reflects a lot of light, that might be a yellow or a green or a blue, and you can then use a light sensor to figure out what volume of those trees or those plants you have. It gets to be a little technical, but if you go to the Ozarks, you'll find the wet places have wet species. The dry places have very dry species. And that's called moisture gradient. So we'll launch ourselves into wilderness. But next week we'll have Don Davis here, and he's just walked some of the Appalachian Trail. So we will discuss, as we have been doing in the last few weeks, wilderness and various types of wilderness and some of the history associated with it. And he's been right there, and in some cases he's right there on the Appalachian Trail, and right over a few trees there's development that will probably be buildings or coal or things like that. So you have to know that some of our wilderness areas are also vulnerable. Come back home, we've got roadsides. We've got a Kickapoo Trail that has the possibility of an adjacent roadside being developed at the same time as a trail. And the trail might be oriented mainly to recreation and not so much to preservation of the habitat. So we will talk about how to put that into an organization which might overlook and care for the way that the trail is developed. So we've been talking about the Wilderness Society and what it did to get the federal government to create a 1964 Wilderness Act that preserved some large areas of open space so that it wasn't accessed by roads or rails or planes or boats. So it was, you could get into it, but you'd have to walk into it and not go into it with a car. So we'll talk about those things next week. But right now I want to say something about local things and what we have done over the years associated with Heartland Pathways, which was the organization that went through the parade. Heartland Pathways has been associated with other groups. They include the Natural Areas Instructional Development. Let's perhaps go back a bit to say that people who come here looking for the ecosystem have a difficult time finding it. It's very good soil, very good for corn and soybeans, to the point that this year we'll have a glut of corn and soybeans. The weather's been very good. The plants are already out there. They're in tassel already. It's not knee-high by the 4th of July. It's sky-high by the 4th of July. And the biomass is absolutely tremendous. There's been the advantage of mechanization going from horses to tractors, and the tractors have gotten bigger and bigger and more specialized. Then we have genetic building to get genetically modified GMOs that are yielding more, but haven't been really quarantined and tested for very long. So there's a whole bunch of people, including Japanese and some of the Europeans, who don't want to buy GMOs because they know that genetics changes naturally. But they also know that if you play with the genetics and change it quickly, like you put a chemical on it and you can change the nucleus of the organism, and you can change it. If it hasn't been tested, they're suspicious of what might be happen with the chemical that is infused, or the modification that's been made, and it won't appear on your life cycle for perhaps 30 or 40 years. Has this material been tested? Well, not really in many of the cases. So it yields well, and it prevents weeds because it's resistant to weeds and resistant to the chemicals that kill weeds. But it's an unknown factor. So we do have elevators that collect non-GMO corn and soybeans, and there are elevators that have had to increase in size, one at Monticello especially, to take the additional yield of GMOs and the genetic breeding that's gone on. We talked about that. You have geneticists that breed and inbreed, and then they crossbreed, and you get hybrid corn that is 12 feet high. Okay. So when you come to this country to find the local ecosystem, you have difficulty. Eventually you find out that it's along the railroad lines where the federal law prevented people from digging up the beds, and it's not always obeyed. But this is where we find our species, prairie species. It might be in what we call a dead cemetery. A dead cemetery is one that hasn't been mowed and hasn't been cared for very well, but it was planted, all the graves that are there were planted into a prairie when it was a prairie. And so cemeteries often have prairie in them that we can't find anywhere else. Also, there's little triangles that you have to back into that you couldn't get a horse team into, but you can get a tractor now. So we're losing some of those little pieces. So we're down to very little prairie that's left. So our wilderness is minor, and what is between Urbana and Danville on the Kickapoo Trail is not the best, but it does involve the bacteria, the fungi, the soils that create the prairie. And you have to know that it's not an ecosystem that is a climax that stays where you would want it to stay if you were trying to conveniently document it. It keeps moving. The dynamic of the bacteria is that it's always stirring and creating new species and new workings with various populations. There are different associations. You need to know those associations. For instance, I look at a thistle, bull thistle, and I immediately say natural area, high calcium. But right now I feel I want to talk to the Department of Transportation, because people recognize a bull thistle as a thistle that we got rid of, even if it has 25 pollinators sitting on it, even if it is a very kind creature. But they don't know the difference between that and Canada thistle, which is a noxious thistle, which is blooming now. And so help me, the Department of Transportation will come along when it's nicely ripe and spread all those little parachutes of seed into the adjacent farmers. So we need to have more education at that level so that we don't screw up what we do have left, and even screw up the farm situation so that you have to put on herbicides or have GMOs that prevent the Canada thistle from taking your crop out. But Canada thistle is very invasive, and so I almost feel like sending a letter to Ann Snyder, who is the director of the Department of Transportation, to say, excuse me, but could you get your mowers to mow and then herbicide the Canada thistle now and not wait till August and move it into other people's property? And they're the sort of things that we do. So when we're looking at wilderness, we have to figure on letting people know what we're doing. So I'm going to run through quickly. How much time am I? 20 minutes. I'll just run through some of the things that we have done over the years so that you know that we're doing things. Finding the ecosystem is the first place. Then going to courses that let you know what ecosystems are, and also working with people informally to know what the ecosystem is, especially the prairie ecosystem locally. We've talked a little bit about the biodiversity. We've talked a little bit about the movement of chemicals through fermentation or through distillation. We've talked a little bit about railroads and dead cemeteries. So what we do next is try and find some organizations that will help this situation. The situation is national. The big Prairie Peninsula between Canada and the Gulf, and between Ohio and the Palouse Prairie in the west, almost to the Pacific. It's a big area, and we don't have too much representation of the various types of prairie that are on it. We're in the Grand Prairie. This is where the prairie was biggest and deepest and tallest and wettest. Okay, so we find those things and we create some organizations, whether it be natural areas, instructional development, educational resources and environmental science, natural areas study group, Grand Prairie Friends, Heartland Pathways. They all contribute to recognizing at the local level what a prairie is. But at the same time, about 30 years ago, there was an organization which felt like this was a national need. So they created the North American Prairie Conference, which meets every 2 years in different locations. The last occasion was in Canada. And that is designed to alert people to the need for the study and preservation of this ecosystem. So the previous conference that was held in Iowa, and there you're talking about graduate students and professors that are professors of prairie, and how do we communicate at that level and then get to a local level. So at the local level, we start to acquire trails and some real estate. So we buy up old abandoned railroad beds using sometimes the interim trail use agreement. So trails get in to be there. And you have trails in the Monticello area, trails in the Kickapoo area. Both have been quite successful in preserving the prairie. We have some invasion at some places where people don't understand what are doing, even though they're farmers. And that's where their agriculture comes from. In 1936, we did not have soybeans. We had people who realized that glycine, the progenitor for soybeans, had to be collected around the world, so that the University of Illinois has the largest collection of glycine, soybean plants. And with the aid of eons of geneticists, that plant has become a very economically important crop, a nutritious crop. It provides food not only for ourselves, but also for the U.S., for the world at large. And that had to come from that plant. Corn is the same, came from teosinte. So we need these wilderness spaces for genetics in the future. We don't know what biochemical we can get out of that for a heart attack or something that happens in the future that we don't even know the disease we'll be fighting. So we acquire railroad beds. We look at the roadside prairie in Savoy. So we have a Savoy prairie. We have private prairies like Lake Park, where 2.5 acres of special little prairie on a reconstruction prairie. They're on what was a cornfield with the aid of Dick Burwash, who owned the property that let us do this, and has been maintained for about 30 years. And it's a moment blooming. The some of the plants are out. It's a June, July peak, and it's doing very well at the present time. We look at settlement history. We looked at the Pepsin factory for about 7 years. We tried to save the Pepsin factory as a story about the entrepreneurship of taking Pepsin biochemical and making it into a syrup of Pepsin that became a very important medicinal, which has continued to this day as Pepto-Bismol. We looked at a Greek revival cottage, worked with the university to preserve that Greek revival cottage, and eventually it has become the headquarters of the Urbana Park District in Lille Park. I want to say that most all of these things we do involve a lot of people. If you look at the Greek Revival Cottage, first of all, you have to work with the university, work with the university physical plant, work with the vice chancellors and others who are in control of that house. That in the case of the Greek Revival Cottage, it was privately owned, not the university owned. But where would you put it? Could you put it in the Champaign Park District? No, because they were looking for a building that would you could do a war cry in it and the floor wouldn't drop dead. So eventually the Historic Museum took it, and the Urbana Park District provided this place in Lille Park. But Lille Park was a cemetery, and there were 2 Indians buried there, and you cannot violate an Indian grave. So there had to be the county coroner and others involved. We were digging a basement to make for an educational base, and we dug up some bones. So those had to be preserved properly. So a lot of interaction here. We went to Shady Rest, which was on the banks of the Sangamon, which was far enough away from town to give you a rural atmosphere on the banks of the river. But it was a picnic ground. It was about as far as you could take a horse, 15 miles. And so it has natural history. It has been had some of the trees harvested, so you have big trees and little trees that have grown recently. but no in-between trees, so that you, as a forest, you can sort of say, this was a picnic ground. And there were all these slabs where you had little houses that were weekenders that you could go and you could fish in the Sangamon. And it also helps to provide what we're looking for as a corridor of green up the Sangamon that helps to keep the river from eroding, but it also makes for interest. So if you take a canoe and put it in at Shady Rest, you can take a day to get to Monticello, which is only down the road 10 miles, but it takes you all day to get there, especially if there's a few trees fallen over and you have to do you have to pass those places. Take your canoe out and put it in again. So we have landscaping and growing plants and selling plants to people that want to grow a prairie in sympathy for the fact that it doesn't exist anymore, and an artificial prairie is you're going to save the species. So Denise, who often sits where David's sitting at the moment, has been wanting to put in and her daughter Holly have been wanting to put in a prairie. So I had to go and see the other day whether the prairie could survive. There are lots of trees. The prairie needs lots of sunlight, so she can't do that. But she can do things like edge timber, where there are plants that sort themselves out where there's some shade. So Shady Rest has gone to the Piatt County Forest Preserve, and that puts it into perpetuity. It puts it into a tax base. It provides for grant money, grantsmanship. So then we get involved with plants that we sometimes dig out of the prairie. That's not as good as growing the plants in the greenhouse with pure soil. When you take them out of the prairie, you also get the helianthus or the sunflowers and the weeds. And so if you plant a plant from the railroad line into an urban situation, you'd like to end up with a whole bunch of railroad weeds if you're not very careful. But we did that, and we taught people that they could landscape their own territory. And Grand Prairie Friends has taken that over and done very well with plant sales. So we have events, and often these are things that have been created by people who came along and saw what we were doing and saying, "Oh, I can do that sort of thing." So we had a rattlesnake master run for the prairie. We ran it for 7 years. We weren't the most efficient running organization, and eventually we gave it to Grand Prairie Friends, and they do much better than we did. And often that's a matter of being at the innovative end of an arrow, where as you go back along the arrow, you get more conservative. And so Grand Prairie Friends has done very well. Actually, we spent about 15 years putting Grand Prairie Friends together. We had a lot of discussion about whether Heartland Pathways should be involved with that organization. We thought no. My attorney felt yes, we should have a place there, but we felt like we didn't want to breathe down anyone's necks. What we were asking Grand Prairie Friends to do was, like the North American Prairie Conference, we needed a local organization that would do interesting things, and they have certainly done that. Recently acquired 2 plots of land that are 141 acres and 200 acres, and we have to think about trusts and how to protect these lands, and how to perhaps hand over some of Heartland Pathways land to this sort of new organization that is doing things better than we can do it ourselves. But sometimes we need to keep some of our things ourselves just so we get some ability to talk to people. So then there's teaching. Teaching informally, like with the Pocket Prairie, but formal teaching at the U of I or the university, in recreation, or at Parkland College with Reading the Landscape, or the School of the Art Institute in Chicago with artists in the landscape. So organizations help, and we already talked about the North American Prairie Conference and what is done to try and bring academia into and the general public into understanding what a prairie is and what that ecosystem is about. We've had many attempts to merge groups, but often groups have their own definition of what they want to do, and it's very hard to get them together. So you have to work with lots of different groups that all bring together things. We get into parades, we get into galleries, we get into recycling, because when you don't have much money, you use secondhand materials and you recycle them, and then you get involved with things like energy conservation and railroading, and we do art interpretation, we do historic preservation, and we look for trust in the future. And we have just a few minutes left, so I want to encourage you to think about what we have done and what we have to do, and realize that there are a lot of people involved in this sort of thing, sometimes not as deeply as we'd like. How do we enlist people? How do we give them jobs that are understandable and not too big? How do we develop master plans that will give us some direction so that if a grant opportunity comes by, can we put in for an application? It's a constant thing. We hope it will go on for generations and generations. So we think 200 years, 500 years, and we hope that you will do the same. It needs administration. It needs accountancy. It needs a lot of those things that are the formal things that we admire when we give over to agencies that have a more formal base. The Grand Prairie Friends has eventually hired an accountant, and that's very essential. It's just too much for a few people to do. At the moment, the Grand Prairie Friends is having to face the fact that the university may no longer be able to rent them greenhouse space. So there are these sorts of discussions backwards and forth, and often there's a difference of opinion, but it's not that different that you got the same overall mission, and you have to balance these sorts of things. That's the same sort of thing that faces WEFT, and how does it go into the future doing things. And we're not all going to be around for a long time, so how do you transmit this to younger people? Some of the contacts I've had in the last few days are absolutely fantastic. I found two people out on the Pocket Prairie, and they were telling each other the flowers and things. I was out to check that they weren't going to climb over the fence and destroy the prairie, but it wasn't so. It was people just interested in teaching each other. That's a principle, is each one teach one, and we'd like to see that. I encountered another group at Carl Park yesterday, and they were looking at monada or bee balm, and there the bees were present. And why were they present there and not on the prairie around the corner? You don't know. So I think we're getting near enough to the end that it's 3 minutes. Okay. But think about belonging to this sort of group to preserve the dignity of your Amazon or your Indonesian forests or your elephants or your giraffes or your prairie. It's important for that gene pool to be there. It's exciting to see its artistry. Go look at the little culvers root that's around the corner. It's a small plant and a small flower, but wow, it's ambiance. Think about putting a trail through it, but not a very big trail. A trail that will allow you to access, but not a trail that's an 8-foot wide concrete strip. Teach people to ride a mountain bicycle but also teach them to ride a regular bicycle on a road. Kevin Elliott is just right now gone to San Francisco to ride a bicycle back to the east. And that may take him a matter of weeks, but mostly he'll be on roads. So how do we teach the traveling population to recognize a bicycle? And how do we convince states to make roads that have edges that don't screw up your bicycle if you have to get off the edge? How do we ask young people not to drive at 80 miles an hour on a road that is used by a bicycle, like from Monticello to Decatur? People ask me, how do you get to Decatur on a bicycle? Well, you take old Route 47 and not the expressway, and you stop on the way, and there's a place where you can have a rest stop, or you can a little town, and the little town has interesting things to find out about it, and just enjoy. And that's enough for today. This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial. And
Dave on the board. And as always, the views and opinions expressed here are those of the speakers, do not necessarily represent those of WEFT, its board of directors, associates, station manager, or Prairie Air Incorporated.
And remember that WEFT is making this possible for you to listen to, and we videotape and go to YouTube, and you can get this in YouTube, and my relatives in Australia can get this in YouTube and think about their ecosystem too.
We've just finished, or we're in the process of doing our airshifter training class right now, so you'd have to wait for a while if you wanted to become active at WEFT, but we are always looking for volunteers. You can do things here at the station without being on the air. I just noticed that we have some flowers that could use some watering, some plants up in the front. If you wanted to volunteer to come in just once a week to do that, we would love to have you as a volunteer for that.